Good evening. We're going to wait and let some of the participants join us. I know it's been kind of rough weather for some of you out there. So we're live on YouTube and we are streaming to our SSCA channel there. And we have Lee Duvall as a new sail owner and Evolution Sales, Jerry Latell. And I'll let a few more people come in and then I'll start our presentation. This is SSCA. This is our webinar on sales and cruising sail design. This is part 2, styles, material, and designs. Evolution Sales, Latell Sailmakers, Jerry Latell. He has offices in Hampton, Virginia, and up in Deltaville. And he's going to be taking us through some rather really detailed information about styles and materials. I want to thank our sponsor, NautiCAD. SSCA members get 2 courses. You can actually get certificates from NautiCAD as you take their courses. And they've made it possible for us to have our webinars. Recordings will be stored at www.ssca.org in our Seven Seas Cruising Association area for webinars SSU. Their question and answers will be at the end of the presentation. April 28th is a sales series part 3, which will follow this, and we hope we'll have Lee talking about his new sales if the weather allows. He's had some problems with weather as we've all had it. And then May 6th is Chesapeake Bay Meander. Second Saturday of each month, we have a free lunch to anyone, virtual lunch online for Annapolis, but we talk a lot of sail issues at that time. And what we'll cover, sale decisions are going to be continued by Lee. Not a lot of decisions this week, past week. Styles, material, function, and design with Jerry Latell, Evolution Sales. This is second in the series of our 3 standalone sessions. And with that, I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to turn this over to Lee for a comment or two. And if you'll turn off your, unmute yourself, Lee, you can tell them where you're at on your sale process, and then we'll turn it over to Jerry.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Unfortunately, weather has interfered with the installation and test sale. The sales were delivered to Jerry last week, but the weather window last week, Monday through Wednesday, that we had planned on getting up to get them installed on Tuesday closed. And the weather window this Monday and today kind of closed down on us. I just don't like sailing out on the bay in gale force winds for some reason. So at this point, we're still on hold, subject to weather going up early next week and getting them installed.
Well, thank you very much for that, for Lee. And, you know, that gives a good example of why you want to have some planning in your efforts to get sales, because things never work out like you think it's going to work out. And with that, I'm going to mute myself. I'm turning it over to Jerry.
All right. Thank you, Joan, and thank you, Lee. Thank you for putting this on, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here with everybody. I'm going to share my screen. I think I can do that. There we go. For those of you who were here last week, we talked about, or those of you who were not here last week, we talked about the sale buying process and kind of this, how you make decisions both on products that you're going to get and on who you want to work with. I mean, I think I'm the obvious choice for everybody, but sometimes I'm not available. So there are a few other sailmakers out there. Had to throw that in there. So this week I wanted to talk about cloth. Actually, I wanted to start by talking about kind of the differences between different boats and rigs a little bit. There's so many different rigs that we can't get into it too much, but I think they're just some typical types that we can cover. And then talk about sail design and sail shape. And the structure of sails, and then talk about cloth a bit, and then at the end talk a little bit about some different off-wind sail options. So we're mostly talking about upwind sails, we're talking about cloth, and then I want to talk about offwind sails options a little bit. And just as we did last week, if you have any questions, please just put it in the chat, and Joan will jump in and stop me. It's, you know, these talks are much easier when I get some feedback and I know what you all are thinking, and you know, if you have questions. So I'd appreciate any questions, just throw them out there. So let me start here. Typical projects. These are kind of typical projects for my loft. We're not a real race-oriented sail loft. You know, being in Deltaville, Virginia, if you've ever been here, this is a real cruisers town. And at the southern Chesapeake Bay, there is racing, and we do plenty of racing sails, but we're lucky that we've got lots of blue water cruisers that come through. We get to work with them, and also blue water racers. This Sabre over here on the left of the screen is a boat that I race a lot on, and we do a lot of offshore races. We're planning to do Annapolis to Newport race in June, and we were hoping to sail to Halifax, do the Marblehead to Halifax race, but that's not going to happen. With COVID, it's just, you know, it's not going to happen. And I think even cruisers are going to have a hard time getting into Canada this summer, let alone, you know, 150 boatloads on us at once. And then, you know, the Pacific Seacraft is a real typical project for us. We actually work with the Pacific Seacraft factory. They're down in Washington, North Carolina. We've been working with them ever since Steve bought the company and brought it from California over to Washington. We love, you know, we love working with those guys. Another thing that our loft does, I just feel like I have to share a little bit because I'm proud of what everybody here does. I don't actually get to do much of this, but we build sails for tall ships. And these are 4 boats that we've done. At this point, we've done a full set of sails for the Eagle. The schooner Virginia here is the top left. We've done sails for her. Pretty sure this is the Susan Constant. See the Susan Constant or Godspeed down there at the bottom left. And we've done sets of sails for them. And then we just finished a set of sails for a Chesapeake Bay skipjack, full traditional hand roped and Oceanus cloth and hand sewn rings and the whole thing. So anyway, back to the modern sailmaking. What we talked about last time, I just wanted to go over it quickly again, is in the sailmaking process. These are the steps, at least from my end. You know, a lot of sail purchasers do not think about this, but for people that are sailing offshore, and sails are, you know, more important to you than they are to the typical guy that's going out for a day sail. I think getting to know sails really well, thinking through the process, and really discussing all the details and knowing exactly what you're getting is critical. So anyway, the process starts with a discussion, and I think that's probably the most important part of the whole process, is talking to a sailmaker and talking to other people and figuring out exactly what you want and nailing it down to all the details. The next step is measurement. You know, it's preferable that be done by a sailmaker. If the sailmaker does the measuring, then, you know, if there's a mistake, it's on him or her. If you do the measurement, it becomes a little more vague. And then it goes to the design process, then the sail cutting and sail construction. And then the delivery and follow-up is, you know, is sort of the second most critical. All of these steps could be happening in different places and but done by different people. I could sell, if I were a salesman at a big loft, I could sell you a sail. Some other guy could go out and do the measurements on the boat, and then a guy anywhere could do the sail design, and then it could be cut and built anywhere in the world, and then come back, and hopefully I'd be the same one at the end, follow up and deliver. And it's not necessarily bad, you know, whether it's done that way or more the old-fashioned way or traditional way, I should say, the way we do, where most of it is done in-house here. We do sub out the construction sometimes, but the rest of it's all done here. And you know, no matter how that happens, I think it's good to know who is going to be doing what, so you know what your expectations should be. So anyway, that's what we talked about last week. I just wanted to go over that again. This is what I would call a traditional sloop. I mean, it's not really traditional, but in terms of comparing a modern design from today with the way production boats are to, you know, a 20-year-old design. This is a Sabre 426. I spend a lot of, this is the same boat. This is actually, it's a sister ship to the boat that I spend a lot of time on, so I know it well. It's got, you know, a traditional main. Most cruisers would have a stack pack, or we have 4 of these at our local yacht club. 2 of them have in boom furling, and 1 has a stack pack, and then the 4th one is the race one. You know, traditional main with some kind of system, and then a big Genoa, which, you know, thankfully we're getting away from. I mean, big Genoas are nice. Well, I shouldn't say thankfully, they're nice in ways. But the trend towards smaller head sails, I think, is a positive trend for boat handling. I like a smaller Genoa. You know, when I'm offshore and we're racing, we have to change these things. It is a chore. So that's what I kind of consider the traditional sloop: a conventional main, a big Genoa. And then speaking of big Genoa, a lot of people don't really understand when we talk about LP, or left perpendicular. Left perpendicular, when you measure, that's what we're talking about when we talk about percentage. Like, this is probably a 140, 135, or 140% Genoa. And we're talking about that. The actual measurement is the shortest distance from clew to left, which, if we remember geometry from, you know, 50 years ago, that also creates a right angle with the left. This is the base of the triangle, if the left is the height of the triangle. So that's how you calculate square footage. You know, the LP, no matter how high the clew is, if you have the same LP, the area of the sail is going to be the same. And the percentage that we're talking about here, this dimension, is a percentage of the distance from the bow to the mast, the J dimension, which is, you know, the base of a right triangle from bow to mast. So that's what LP is. LP does not have to do with the clew height or the foot length, but it's this measurement that gives you the overall size of the sail. All right, and then a really nice blue water rig is the cutter rig. We're all familiar with that. This boat is nicely set up. It's got the staysail. It's got a Genoa. It's probably a 105 or 110%. The clew is kind of high, so it overlaps a bit. And then it's got a sail pack to help handle the conventional main, traditional reefing, either single line or a hook up front. I think we're all familiar with this. It's a great way to go. We can also, you know, we also talk about other double head sail rigs. There's a Solent rig. We do a lot of boats. I haven't done a lot, but we've done some, and I think it's a really nice option. Is rather than having a hard staysail stay, you can use one of these modern Code Zero furling systems with a torsion cable and make a staysail out of that. And what you have is a staysail that works just like a normal staysail, but when you're done with it, you can drop it to the deck and coil the whole thing up, the stay, the sail, the furler, everything, and get it out of the way. So it's a much, I think it's a great option for a lot of boats. And that can either be in the traditional staysail position, or it can be more pushed forward as a Solent stay. If you're thinking about something like that, talk to somebody. There are lots of options. You can run a storm sail off the same furler. So anyway, I really like having the option of an inner stay of some sort. Yeah, it reminds me of, you know, a lot of people want to, you know, first time offshore want to carry a storm jib, and they have me make them a storm jib with a number 6 left tape on it, with the idea that they're going to drop their big Genoa and put up a storm jib. And for all of us who have been offshore in any kind of conditions that make us start thinking about a storm jib, the last thing you'd want to do is unroll your reef Genoa, drop it, and put up a storm jib. So an inner stay gives you much more options in terms of storm conditions, and you know, I really like that. And then here's kind of the modern production boat, and there are lots of positives with these boats. They're very simple. I mean, an in-mast furling main and a it's slightly overlapping these Genoas now, but basically, you know, they're small Genoas. You know, you can see that the shroud on this boat is outboard. So the Genoa comes back to the shroud essentially, and it's limited by that. So it's simple, relatively small sails are easy to handle. These hulls are relatively light and easily driven, so it works, at least upwind. The weakness with this kind of rig is when you turn off the wind, you really lose power. And it's funny, you wouldn't think about these furling mains. You think about the roach that you've lost as, at least in my mind, as a racer, that it would hurt you going upwind, but it really seems to be, you know, the difference between a conventional main and a furling main seems to be greater off the wind on a reach than it is upwind. And so boats like this really need auxiliary sails, some kind of spinnaker or code zero. And I'm going to talk about that later, but it's, you know, these are kind of the different types of rigs that I, at least in the way that I think about them and that we deal with. And then of course, lots of boats now are these funny boats that are like two boats put together. And this is a pretty typical rig for a multi-hull with a smallish jib and a big roachy full batten mainsail. This is a nice rig in lots of ways. It's got these big reefs. You can reduce the mainsail size down. The Genoa can be reefed just like you can on other boats. Given, you know, assuming that you have a foam luff pad or a rope luff pad to make it shapeable when reefed. The challenges are, you know, the size of this sail. You know, you almost have to have a powered winch when you get to a boat of a certain size with this type of rig. But you know, with the big reefs, you got lots of options. It's a fair amount of sail area. We find that catamarans are kind of similar to the, you know, the Genoas and the modern monohulls, in that they also suffer a bit off the wind without big Genoas. That, you know, when you turn off the wind, it's nice to have an auxiliary sail on these boats as well. All right, let me talk a little bit. If there are any questions, just slow me down, throw it out there, put it in the chat, or use the Q&A. Let me see it on that. So sail shape and sail structure. I just wanted to talk about this a bit. It's how I talk a bit about how we, you know, there are only certain ways that you can shape a sail. It's not actually magic. We pretend it is. And it's easy to think that it's just magic how you shape a sail, but it's actually pretty straightforward. Not simple, but it's relatively simple, but it's not easy and it's not perfectly intuitive. So defining shape, how sails are shaped, and then the stresses in a sail before we look at, you know, how we put them together and what we're looking for. So let's start here. So defining shape. To the right-hand side of the screen would be the luff, the forestay or the mast, and the left hand is the leech. You can see there's a little more, it's not a great curve that I've drawn here, but there's more shape forward and it's flatter in the exit, which is what you want in a sail. The cord length, if we're defining shape, we define it from the cord length, which is a straight line from luff to leech. And essentially, we're looking at a slice in the sail. And when we're designing sails, we look at these slices. We look at them individually, and then we also look at the vertical distribution of all these slices. But if you were just to take a knife and slice across the sail front to back, we had a sail in here this week that was split front to back. It probably didn't have much shape left in it, but it happens. When we look at a slice in the sail like this, we define it, the depth is defined as a percentage. So the depth here is a percentage of this cord length. So this is 13%. The position of maximum draft, we also define as a percentage of this cord length. Because if you can imagine, you can't do it in absolute numbers, because as you move up and down the sail, everything changes. You know, the cord length reduces obviously as you go up, so the position changes. And then we also look, in addition to the maximum draft and the position of it, we look at the entry angle and exit angle, and you know, different programs define the entry and exit a little differently. But you know, we're looking at the entry and exit, you know, as much as we're looking at the rest of this. A racing sail out of a really firm, low stretch cloth, you can have a very flat exit. If you do that with, you know, not the best Dacron or woven polyester cloth, you could end up with a big mess, because if it stretches a bit, the leech will open up and start flapping. So you have to put a little more shape, depending on, you know, the softer the cloth or the stretchier the cloth, you got to put a little more shape in the back end. You know, one thing we do is, if we're defining a race sail out of the bag, all of this shape will be exactly where you want it to be for the absolute best performance right out of the bag. If it's a cruising sail or a racing sail that's made out of not the best cloth, we would adjust the shape so that as the sail ages, the shape will move kind of through the ideal spot over time, give it a little more time. And what happens is, as sails age, the draft moves back and they become deeper. I think we all know that. So to counteract that, as I said, if I were building a Genoa out of a soft cloth, I would put the position of max draft several percentage places ahead of where I really want it to be, knowing that as the sail ages, it's going to stretch and move back. And the same with the depth, and make it a little flatter. Just things to think about. So that is depth. And when we're teaching sail shapes and trimming sails, you think a lot about the depth, and that's a linear thing. As the wind increases, you want your sails to be flatter, so you do what you can to trim them to make them flatter. The second idea, other than shape or depth in the sail and position of the depth, is one thing, and then the second idea is twist. So if you stand under your boom, or stand, sometimes if you could stand on top of your mast and look down, you could see that all those slices in the sail as you go up are not in the same plane. They actually shift as they go up. And that's what we talk about in twist. It's easier to see if you're standing on deck and look, use your boom as a reference point, put your face almost right on the boom and just sight up the sail. You can see, you look, on your mainsail, you look at your batten pockets, and each one is a little bit more twisted. If you pull your sheet on as hard as you can in very light air, you can pull all this twist out of your sails, and all of your, all these cords essentially would be in line, and you have no twist. Twist when you're trimming sails is a little less of a linear thing. In light air, you want more twist to help airflow over your sails. In medium air, you want the least amount of twist. And then in heavy air, you add twist again to help spill air and depower your sails. If you open up the top, you can depower. So that's twisting it when you open it up. Ease your sheet, your main sheet, move your general car aft, and it opens the top of the sail and creates more twist. And you can do that while still keeping the sail flat by keeping your halyard tight and your outhaul tight. So you're not changing the depth, you're just changing the twist. And I'll talk about this a little more next week, because next week we're going to talk about, as your sails age, what can you do, both in terms of keeping them alive structurally and trimming them a little differently to keep good helm balance and boat speed. So we'll talk a little more about twist next week, but if you got questions, shout them out. Now they're, you know, in the, you know, the magical world here that I, you know, we like to kind of maintain a mystique about sailmaking as if there's some magic or something, you know, secretive that happens. The truth is that when we're shaping sails, we have two tools. We have broad seam and luff curve, and that's really it. Broad seam is, you know, this is an exaggerated view, but every panel on a sail has some shape in it. Every seam, I should say, the edge of every panel. So when you put those two curved edges together, it creates shape. If you think about a beach ball is an extreme example of this. You know, you've taken flat panels and they become a ball because you put so much shape into each of those crescent shaped panels. We don't put that much shape in a sail usually. But as I said, every seam, you know, this represents a cross-cut sail. Every seam has some shape, and it varies as you go up and down the sail, of course, but it'll have some shape to create a flying wing shape. And, you know, when you lay a sail on the floor, it's, you know, once it's put together, seamed together, it never lays flat again. It's always got that shape in it. So that's broad seam. And, you know, interestingly, they call it broad seam because in the old days, before computerized cutting, they would, instead of cutting all the edges of the panels like this, they would simply overlap the panels more at each end to create this shape. And so the seams would become broader, more, you know, wider, more broad seams at the front and the back as they increase the overlap to do this same thing to create that shape. So that's where the term broad seam comes from. We don't actually broad seam sails anymore, but we still call it broad seam. And then the second tool we have is luff curve. So if you have a mainsail and you put a positive curve in the front of the sail in the luff, and then you put that curve, attach it to a mast, and the mast is straight, it's going to push the middle of the cloth back into the sail and create shape. So it makes the sail deeper. And we have some control as we're sailing over luff curve. You know, if you have most of us on cruising boats, we don't have adjustable backstays, but if you have an adjustable backstay and it affects the curve of your mast, you can actually flatten your sail some. Actually, you can do it a fair amount if you have a bendy mast by putting more backstay tension on and making your mast curve. And when you curve the mast, it actually pulls that shape out of the middle of the sail. And more importantly than this, since most of us are sailing boats that we're not adjusting the backstays, I'm assuming, or you don't have a backstay on a catamaran, this same thing is happening with your Genoa, except that there's not positive curve in Genoas, but there's hollow. We put a little bit of luff hollow in a Genoa, and there's an art to it. There is some art to all of this. What we're doing is we're matching that curve. You know, we're talking about a Genoa now. We're matching the curve in the front of your Genoa to what we expect the deflection in your headstay to be when you're sailing. If you think about it, there's no way to make your forestay tight enough that it doesn't deflect a little bit. So it's always curved. As soon as you load up a sail and it's pulling against your forestay, there's curve in your forestay. And my job is to predict what that curve is going to be and match the curve, the luff curve of your Genoa to that curve. And some of the things that we see, some of the things that you can do is, I often get on boats where the rigs haven't been tuned and the forestays are much looser than they should be. Furling systems really like a firm to really, you know, lots of tension on a forestay. The straighter the forestay is, the happier furler is going in and out. A loose forestay can, as we were just talking, it will sag into the sail and create more shape. And what happens is, of course, as the wind builds, it sags more and creates more shape in the sail and makes the sail deeper, when you would, ideally you'd want the sail to be flatter. So proper rig tune is critical to match up to the sails that we build. And new sail, old sail, having a properly tuned rig is important. I mean, structurally is the main thing. It's got to be tuned enough that it's not going to come down. But a big mistake that we see is forestays that are too loose. And when you create a really full Genoa like that, it can contribute to weather helm and imbalance, and it'll cause you to heel more and all sorts of things. Okay.
Jerry, I have a question. This is
Yes.
Joan. Okay, tuning your rig. As we are watching and listening to you talk, we realize that the tuning of the rig is very dependent on, well, the sail design tells you how to, tune the rig and whatnot. And I'm wondering, do most riggers, you're talking to someone, did you want to talk to somebody, Jerry?
Well, I got a
do most
DHL
riggers-
delivery. Can I pause for 1 second and sign for a package?
Sure.
I'm the only one here. I'm really sorry.
Yeah. No, that's fine. But the question that I wanted to ask him was on riggers. They all depend on rigger A, B, or C in the different places we go to, but it's becoming more and more clear that that's very important. And Jerry, what I mentioned was that riggers, we have people who say they are riggers, but it is very important the rigger is a good one, because you end up with it seeing what happens when it isn't. And we can do that or take that with series 3, but I would like to sometime talk about riggers and some ideas for what we should expect from them, but maybe do that in series 3. But again, if your rigging isn't tuned up and it isn't set right, you're going to have a real problem, as near as I can tell.
Right. Well, yeah, you can. And you want your mast nice and straight, side to side. The mast rake is something that can be adjusted. And then the overall tension is kind of the third thing that you want to make sure is correct. And your rig tune is it's really kind of nuts and bolts. You can look at videos, you can read some books. I know most people are a little apprehensive, or more than a little apprehensive, about tuning their own rigs. But it's something you can do yourself. At least I feel like I can do it myself, and I've been in this business for 20 years, so my perspective is a little skewed. But it is something that a lot of people, you can look at videos, you can read about it, you can at least get a good idea of what should be happening before you hire a rigger. And then working with the rigger is like working with a sailmaker or anybody else. It's all about that discussion and talking through what's going to happen and what they're going to do and what you're expecting. So I'm really sorry. The DHL delivery needs my help carrying something in, so I have to pause for 1 second. I'm really sorry. Joan, can you take over for a minute?
I'll take over.
Okay.
I'll take over. Does anyone have any questions? Because we have either chat or Q&A, and I know that John is out there, Dee is out there. We have the Davises out there, all either looking at what might be done for their rigs or have some ideas. Throw something into the chat so Jerry can reply, because I think he's got some pretty experienced, and I'm pretty impressed with what he's put together for us. Anyway, we have as participants quite a few good experienced people, and we're streaming the live stream. Unfortunately, I can't switch over to the live stream and look at who's there, but normally we have about 50 people watching, and I think the average, that's what we've got going right now. But if you have any questions, I've had some not fun experiences offshore. I think all of us have had that. And we had a bad experience with, and I just didn't know it until Jerry told us about it last time, that you don't recut a sail and take a roach off if someone designed it wrong. But that was our life. So I'll turn it back to Jerry now. I see The DHL delivery is done. He has survived. So we will go back to
Yes, thank you. I'm so sorry about that. She was a very nice young woman, and it was a heavy sail, and I had to help her carry it in here. And this is one of the joys of living in the country, is we get deliveries late. We're at the end of the line down here in Deltaville. Yeah, Joan was talking about her recut sail, and we'll talk about that next week because I can work that in a little better. But I can explain why, if somebody says they're going to recut a sail, if somebody buys a used sail and wants to reshape it, or if you have a new sail that doesn't fit exactly, and the sailmaker wants to reshape it or recut it, resize it, I should say. There are proper ways to do it, and there are incorrect ways to do it. So we'll talk about that a little next week. I'll make a note. Okay, so that's riggers, recutting sails, and DHL deliveries. So moving on. So when we're looking at the structure of a sail, one of the big things we look at is the aspect ratio. And when we talk about aspect ratio, it's either high aspect, which is this isn't an overly high aspect sail, but this mainsail is a relatively high aspect, meaning the ratio of left to foot is, probably 3 to 1 there. So 3 to 1 or higher, we'll say, is definitely considered high aspect. 2 to 1 would be low aspect, and this Genoa is a relatively low aspect sail. If you think about it, the loads in this main are pretty linear. On a high aspect sail, the loads are pretty much up the leach. You get some other loading, but the big loads are really up the leach. When you get into a low aspect sail, the loads are more dynamic, and they're coming out of the corners and moving into the body of the sail more. There's more loading, like these arrows that I'm showing. Just the biggest load's still up the leach, but there's more load out in the middle of the sail in a low aspect sail. And talking about cloth, you can sort of see why that makes a difference. And we're going to talk about cloth now. So when you're looking at cloth, there are sort of 3 directions to a cloth. The short dimension is called the fill. The long, or it used to be called the weft. We call it the fill, the short dimension. The long dimension is the warp. And then, the 45 dimension is called the bias. And all 3 are important. I look at a lot of sailcloth graphs every week. And, you look at the numbers for, the fill numbers, the warp numbers, the bias numbers. The bias number is one of the more important ones. If you have a really stretchy bias, the sail is going to be a mess, kind of no matter what the other numbers are. So you have to have at least a firm enough bias that it's not going to get real stretchy. If you're thinking about the stretch on cloth, if you think of a handkerchief, I think most of us are old enough to remember handkerchiefs. If you pull it from side to side, straight across, it's not super stretchy. Or you can do a bed sheet. If you're pulling with the fibers, you can pull a certain amount. But if you go and you pull on the bias on the 45, angle, it's very stretchy. And that's one of the tricks with sailcloth that the cloth guys are always working on, is reducing that bias stretch. They do it a couple of ways. One is interlocking the fibers very tightly. When we talk about Dacron, we haven't actually used Dacron fibers in 20 years. Dacron was a DuPont fiber that was made for, it was made for sailmaking, but we've moved on to other fibers. And I said, we're into well beyond the actual capital D Dacron days. We still call this cloth Dacron generically, but it's woven polyester. And when they the first step, of course, is weaving this stuff. The next step is heat setting it, and the sailcloth will actually shrink like 20% in the heat setting or shrinking process. And what that does when it shrinks is it locks these fibers together, and you get a lot of bias stability out of that locking, that mechanical lock. The other way you can get a lot of bias stability is with finish, and they'll put resin on cloth, and we've probably all heard of racing Dacrons or polyester, woven polyesters have a lot of resin in them, and so they're very stable when they're new, and you have to be very careful with them not to wrinkle them, because as you wrinkle them, they break down, and that resin breaks down, and they become very stretchy. So either locking together the fibers or resin or some combination is how you get bias stability. Here's a blow-up picture. There's something called crimp. And so in this picture, this cloth we'll say is what we call a fill-oriented cloth, meaning it's lowest stretch on the short dimension on the fill. And so these would be the fill fibers, these straight ones, and then the warp fibers are all woven over and under, and those fibers take all the crimp. And so if you pull this cloth on the fill, as soon as you pull on it, you're pulling directly on the straight fiber. When you pull on the warp, you're pulling the crimp out of it, or some of that crimp out of it, before you're really pulling on the fiber. So it's going to be stretchier on the warp, which is on our screen, the vertical dimension. But crimp is the idea of the fibers going over and under each other and taking that shape. So crosscut versus radial. And this is why you have to use specific cloth for each. You don't just use any old cloth if you're going to make a radial sail. Most of the really good Dacron or woven polyester is fill oriented, meaning it's strongest on that short dimension, has the least amount of crimp usually, and some bigger, larger yarns in that direction. So it's very low stretch. And when you make a crosscut sail, this is the challenge sailcloth drawing, and it's really not totally accurate. These panels are perpendicular to the leech. Remember we talked about that. The biggest loads are up the leech, and these panels will be perpendicular to those loads, so that the fill is taking all the biggest loads. To make a good radial sail, it's got to be lowest stretch, or at least low stretch on the warp, on the long dimension. And weaving cloth, if you think about it, it's much harder. It's to make fill-oriented cloth, you pull the short fibers tight and weave the long fibers over and under them. To make a warp cloth like that, it's much harder to weave a cloth with fill fibers taking more of the crimp than the long warp fibers. And there's some tricks to it. And it involves, really high-end fibers. The looms move more slowly. And then there's some magic involved, I think, as well. And so good, true warp-oriented radial construction cloth is significantly more expensive than crosscut cloth. So you need to be careful. If you're going to buy a radial sail, you need to make sure that it's a true radial cloth. Slow me down if you need to, and ask questions, because I've gone longer than I thought, and I'm going to speed up a little. And then the laminate cloth. So there are two types of cloth, essentially, two worlds. One is woven, and it can be, one's woven and one's laminate. This is an example of a sort of a blow up of a laminate cloth. For cruising, the laminate will have taffeta on the outsides, the outer layers, which is a loosely woven polyester. It'll have some film, either one film, and this blow up, it has two films. And then it'll have a base layer, like what they're describing is the X-ply or the Technora black scrim. That'll be sort of a basic XY kind of scrim, give it some basic stability, and then it would have the largest fibers for the load, the major load bearing. And with and most of these laminate cloths are designed for radial construction. So those big fibers are going down the length of the cloth. There are some cross-cut laminates that are nice, and they actually have load-bearing fibers in a couple different directions to mimic a radial sail. But the bulk of laminate cloth, as I said, is a radial work-oriented cloth.
Jerry, we have
yes.
a question that goes with laminate, and so it might be good to bring that up now. Kirsten is mentioning she's buying a new catamaran, and is a recommendation to have custom sails built. For builders offering 3 levels of sails, basic Dacron, cruising laminate, and racing lighter laminate. We're interested in the cruising type of sails for our liveaboard sailing. So of these different types that you've been talking about, what would make sense for a cruising sail that where she's asked this question?
Boy, the third option I don't think would be a good one. A light racing laminate if your plan is to live aboard and to really cruise. And I'm sort of skipping ahead, but some of the looking at the pluses and minuses of radial or woven versus laminate cloth. A woven cloth is ultimately more durable. It'll last significantly longer than a laminate cloth. Ultimately, construction wise or ultimate durability. The laminate cloth will hold its shape longer. So there's sort of a spectrum between ultimate durability and performance, and the laminate cloth is, as I said, more on the performance side, much more. So the sails are lighter, lower stretch. The woven, if you're talking about polyester, is more durable, less expensive, won't mildew, as well as one other thing. The other option that I hadn't talked about yet is there are some woven cloths, some really nice woven cloths that actually have spectra woven into them. Dimension Poly has a cloth called Hydronet, and Contender Sailcloth has they call theirs the Pro Hybrid. I think that those are kind of the ultimate cruising cloths. They have really good low stretch qualities. They're not quite as light as a laminate cloth, but ultimate durability is much better, and performance is not that far off from a laminate cloth. That may not be an option for you, but I would look into those as kind of really the ultimate cloth for if you're liveaboard cruising. You're going to be in a lot of sun. UV eats up everything. I think the laminate sails don't last quite as well in UV as the wovens. You just have to weigh your options. As I said, the woven cloth that they're offering from the builder will last longer and will put up with more abuse than the laminate cloth. The laminate cloth will be lighter and will hold its shape better over time. So there's no right or wrong answer, but you just need to figure out which one matches what you want to do better. Does that make sense? Kind of a long rambling answer.
Hey Jerry, thank you. That gives some really good ideas. I wasn't aware that you could have the woven in the spectra. Sounds interesting.
It is. It's been around. Hydronet's been around for a while, and we've done a ton of sales out of it for a lot of catamarans, bigger cruising boats. It's a cloth. It's very expensive. The Hydronet cloth is about 5 times as expensive as a woven, a standard cross-cut woven cloth. So the end sail is typically about double the cost of a cross-cut woven sail. So there's definitely an upfront cost, but the the cloth lasts virtually forever and keeps a really good shape. If you're going to sail your boat around the world and you want to not worry about it and have, you know, the ultimate durability, that's the kind of cloth that I would think about.
Jerry, can I throw in an observation?
Yes.
I guess one factor is I've had to deal with a number of times more than I want to is safety factor too. Failure mode. What would be the issues between the laminates and the Dacron when you get caught out in that one time where you really didn't want to be out there in the Dacrons versus that? I'm going to mute now and let you answer that.
Okay. Yeah, a woven cloth ultimately is more durable. So if you get out in a storm and you're just flogging your sails, that, you know, like if you took two boats together and one had a laminate sail, one had a woven sail, and you just let them flog until they died, the woven sail is probably ultimately going to be more durable. But, you know, a good laminate sail should be pretty darn durable and should be able to put up with pretty much anything. You know, short of just ultimate abuse.
If it does fail, is there any significant difference between being able to repair one yourself if needed?
The cruising laminates have taffetas, so you can stitch them together. You know, woven sail is probably a little easier maybe to get repaired in a far off place. But yeah, I mean, some of these really high-tech cloths are glued together and you need adhesives and things to fix them. And actually that's a positive as much as a negative, because you can use some epoxies to repair sails. But I don't think there's a huge difference. I guess the bottom line is there's not a huge difference in getting one of these things repaired if you have an issue.
Now, Tori asked, Jerry, he asked, doesn't the taffeta covering add to the durability of the sandwich laminate cross radial cruising sails?
The taffeta on the laminate is you really you have to have the taffeta. You know, we've all seen mylar film mylar sails. Those are quite fragile. What happens in a film sail is that the little spaces between the fibers, and there's, you know, little windows, we call them, between the fibers, which is just mylar film against mylar film with glue in the middle, they break down there. The mylar film breaks down, and that's where race sails always fail. Film sails always fail in the windows, and then, you know, long before the fibers start to go, the mylars go in. Taffetas on both sides pretty much do away with that issue. They give it more bending strength. They, you know, close in those windows so you don't have the brittleness of the brittleness, if that's a word. The windows are a bit brittle, and with the taffetas they're not. They're much better in folding and bending and stretch and that kind of thing. So yeah, the taffetas are critical to a good cruising cloth. And now we have, just to make it more fun for everybody when you're trying to figure all this out, we have non-woven taffetas that we're using, which are, just as I said, they're non-woven, so they're lighter weight. They help with durability. They don't help in abrasion. They're not as good in abrasion as they are with flex strength. So they, you know, these non-woven taffetas help if you're bending the sail to keep the windows from cracking, but they're not great with abrasion. You can rub those things off if it rubs against something. So, you know, the non-woven taffetas are another way. So the performance sails that are an option on this new catamaran, the performance sails may have non-woven taffetas, which get rid of a fair amount of weight without getting rid of any of the structure, you know, the load-bearing fibers or any of that structure. Hopefully that answers that.
So what this tells me is you need to really trust the person you're talking to who's making your sails, and really talk the different pieces out to be sure you're getting what you need for the way you cruise.
You do, and I'm one that always errs on the side of being conservative. if it seems like it's just a little too out there or a little too performance oriented, and you want, I would move to the closer to the sail that and the thing that you're comfortable with. And I think in most situations with sails, you can't go wrong by doing that. Hopefully that makes sense. If we're used to woven sails and moving from a woven sail to a light skin, super high tech sail, maybe we move back to a taffeta sail that's a little closer to what we understand and know and are comfortable with. But yeah, I mean, there's so many different options out there. It's hard on sailmakers to really, to be able to get rid of the noise and focus on exactly what's right. All right, so reviewing this, we haven't even discussed the sail on the left here, which is what we call a string sail. And this is just one type of laminate sail where the cloth and the sail are made at the same time. So this sail would be designed, and then a machine, or what would happen was the sail is designed and all of the loads are predicted in the sail and the amount of fiber that's needed. And you can distribute all that fiber exactly where you want it. So there's a lot less fiber up in the luff of the sail, a lot more back in the leech. If, across the foot there's some. If it's a mainsail and you had reefs, you could put more fibers where the reefs are. And you design the sail that way. And then what happens is you have a big machine, a big floor with a machine on it. And you lay out a triangle of cloth, usually mylar, and then with a skin or a taffeta on it. You lay that down, you lay one side down. The machine goes over and lays all these load-bearing fibers, you can see in this sail. And then the other side is put on top of that, sandwiched on there. The whole thing is laminated together. So you actually create the sail and the cloth at the same time. And then if you remember what I was talking about shaping the sail, they actually come back and cut that triangle, in a number of places in order to put it back together and broad seam it to put the shape in it. Doesn't hurt it, but it's just interesting to note that you still have to do the same old thing, broad seaming the sail in order to put shape in it. And then this boat on the right, these are laminate sails, and you can see that the main is higher aspect. So we went with a crosscut sail that's a little more cost effective. You use cloth more effectively. There's a little less labor. And then for the Genoa with its lower aspect, we did a radial sail. I think I'm getting close to running over here, so I got to be careful. And I've got a little more on the talk, but we can talk about it next time too, so we can kind of cut off where we need to for time, Joan. But when you're making decisions about cloth, I think the first decision you need to make are the fibers, which are the level of performance that you want, how low stretch the sail needs to be. For most of us, polyester fibers are just fine, especially for cruisers. But as I said, you can get into a woven cloth with spectra in it, and then you can get into these laminates with all kinds of carbon and Tauron and different aramid fibers. So that's the first thing to decide. And then, woven versus laminate. And, if we stick with polyester, a woven polyester sail versus a laminate polyester sail, the pluses and minuses of that for your application. And then radial versus crosscut. Is crosscut going to work well for your boat, or do you need to move to a radial sail? And radial is more on the the performance side. And then looking at, high and low aspect is not a direct decision to be made, but it's a consideration. And then something I haven't talked about is the grade of cloth. There are, if you look in the Challenge Sailcloth catalog, they have probably 5 different types of crosscut Dacron, crosscut woven polyester, ranging from what I sort of call an OEM type cloth. It would be the least expensive stuff that you would find, up to the really premium stuff. And the differences are just huge between those different cloths. The fibers are different, the way they weave them are different, the bundles, just the way they finish them, all sorts of things. So it's important to ask the question about the cloth itself. And then fiber sizes. When you're looking at these cloths, we were talking about the way cloth locks together creates bias stability. Smaller fibers locked together will create more crossovers and more bias stability, but small fibers are not that great in UV. If you get into a really small fiber, it gets eaten up much faster than a large fiber. So if you're going to be, charter boats in the Caribbean have their needs are very different than a performance sailor, and what they need are big fiber bundles woven together in a way that gives them lots of UV stability. So, UV stability is a question if you're going to be someplace with a lot of UV. Where we are in Virginia, we have sort of what I consider moderate sun. It's definitely more than New England, but it's nothing like Florida or the Caribbean. So those are, there's just lots of questions. And I'm bringing all this up to sort of get you thinking rather than to give you a quiz at the end. So stop me if there are any questions. And Jonah, we're booked until 7, so I think we'll stop on this slide. This is, we deal with, literally hundreds of customers a year discussing sales, going through all the things that I just talked about, radial versus crosscut, laminate versus woven, whether you have high or low aspect, the size of your Genoa. I mean, there are just tons of things that we talk about. But in terms of cloth, we go through all these discussions and we almost, 90% of the time we end up on crosscut woven polyester, and people come in and say, I don't want an old-fashioned sail. I don't think these are old-fashioned at all. Crosscut woven polyester is still the standard sail out there, and for good reason. It's cost effective, and they last almost too long in my mind. They don't mildew. They're easy to repair. They're forgiving. Just lots and lots of positives. But I think it's worth exploring if you're going to buy new sails to think through, all the options.
Jerry, thank you very much.
Sure.
Lots of things to think about. This recording is going to be stored and will be available on YouTube. And we'll see you next week. I really want to thank you for a very informative presentation. Lots of things to think about. We have Kirsten, who's getting a new catamaran, it sounds like, with new sails. And she says, thank you so much, very informative. We have people who are looking at either getting new sails or figuring out why their sails don't work. And we have Lee, who's getting his new sails. We hope next time we'll hear a bit more, but it may be a little bit longer. Just depends on the weather. That's something to take into consideration with sails. You better worry about the weather. We have Tony Salvia has joined us. Tony helps me with the Seven Seas University. He's also a professional filmmaker and has Sailing Flicks, the Sailing Channel TV, with some wonderful products. But I'll tell you something, Jerry, what you've shared with us is probably as good, if not better, than most of the videos that I have seen out there talking about sails and sails repair or choosing sails. So I want to thank you, and we will see you next week. I have a chat message here. That is from Kirsten. Thank you, Kirsten. And we will see you next week. If anyone wants to join us, you can register again. But I really appreciate it, Jerry. Go home and take care of your youngster. And thank you all for participating.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you all for listening to me ramble for an hour. Appreciate it. It was fun.
Thank you, Jerry. And thank you, Joan, for putting this together.
And thank you all for joining.